Welcome on back, everybody. This is the All Aussie Rules YouTube channel. This is mid-season review time for the Melbourne Demons. As always, well, all of these mid-season reviews, at least, we're going to be looking at their season so far. We'll have a look at a little player wrap-up, just a tiny little look at not each player, just some of the good players. What they've still got to come this year and what we can expect from them for the rest of 2024 AFL season. It's been an up and down season for the Demons for sure, so we'll jump straight into that very shortly. But as always, we run through at the start. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. We also have the podcast that goes live on Spotify and YouTube Mondays and Fridays. We also have plenty of social medias. We've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. We're at All Aussie Rules on all of them, so go check them out. All the support is appreciated. This week is a busy week on the YouTube channel, especially. We've already had the Round 13 review go out on Monday night. Then Tuesday we had the Carlton and Essendon mid-season reviews go live. Geelong one will have gone live a few hours ago. This is the Melbourne one. And then tomorrow on Thursday we're going to have West Coast and Gold Coast mid-season reviews go live. And then Friday morning at roughly 8 a.m. We'll have the Round 14 preview going live on Spotify and YouTube. So don't forget to follow along, hit the notification bell, check out all of this content. There's plenty coming over the coming weeks. There's still 6 more mid-season reviews to come after this week, which will be all in next week. But without any further ado, let's jump into the Melbourne Demons season so far. I'm not sure what to make of their season, to be honest. It's been a bit up and down. We'll jump straight into the games and then we'll have a bit of a discussion about where we think they are, because it's a confusing season, to be honest. So opening round, they played Sydney and they lost it by 22 points. They certainly had their chances this day. Sydney kicked away in that final quarter. Brodie Grundy was won the ruck matchup that day. One of the only times Max Gawn has been beaten this year was in round 1. Not a bad result in hindsight. At the time, it looked like it was a poor performance from them. But Sydney have shown this year that they are clearly the best team in the AFL at the moment, and Sydney at the SCG is clearly the best, the hardest prospect for any team at the moment. So not a terrible result round 1, and they kind of showed that over the following month, because they went out against the Bulldogs and won by 45 points in what was a pretty dominant display at the MCG. Round 3 they played Hawthorn, and once again they showed dominance again. They won this one by 55 points. They were 5 goals up at quarter time. They looked in control of the whole game basically and got a comfortable win. So they then had 2 weeks in a row in Adelaide, and this is where I guess everybody kind of started looking at them as premiership chances, because they beat Port Adelaide at Adelaide Oval on a Saturday night, and then the following week they played Adelaide Gather Round Thursday night, and they won that one as well. So they beat Port Adelaide by 7 points, and they beat Adelaide by 15 points. Both games, especially mainly the Port Adelaide one, to be honest, could have gone either way. They kicked very straight, took their chances. Port Adelaide were in it, but just wasted some opportunities and ended up going down. The Adelaide game was kind of the reverse. Melbourne wasted a lot of opportunities. They kicked 10 goals 18 that day, and could have probably and should have won by a bit more than they did. So at this point they're 4-1, and they certainly were looking like maybe one of the top 3 or 4 chances in the AFL this season. And then they hosted Brisbane at the MCG, and this is where they're like complete topsy-turvy season for them started. Hosting Brisbane at the MCG, which typically, yes, granted it would be a tough matchup, but Brisbane at this point were struggling. I think they were 1-4 maybe. Is that how many games they played? Yeah, 1-4 I think off the top of my head. So they were really struggling, and then this was at the MCG and they lost it by 22 points. Granted, they kicked poorly again second week in a row, but they were never in this. They lost the first quarter by 14 points. They lost the second quarter by 16 points. They lost the third quarter by 13. So they were 43 points down at three-quarter time. They did come back a little bit in the last quarter. But it just was a game that if they were really contenders, I don't think they lose that. So interesting result for them nonetheless. They then had their bye in round 6. Round 7 they came out against Richmond and did what they needed to. Obviously Richmond, especially at this point of the season, were really struggling with injuries. And Melbourne won it by 43 points. They got the job done. And then this one is the reverse of the Brisbane game. They're going up against the currently, at the point that they played them, undefeated Geelong. Kicked poorly, 10 goals 14, and still won by 8 points. So you just don't know what you're going to get at the moment with Melbourne at this point of the year. They lose to Brisbane at home, but then they go and beat Geelong, who were undefeated. And to be honest, it gets more confusing after this. So anyway, they beat Geelong. They're now back in a good spot again. 6-2 finals, looking pretty comfortable for them at this point. And then all of a sudden, their season goes downhill very quickly. Round 9, they play Carlton. They just don't quite get there. They were outside of the first quarter, so they went scoreless in the first quarter. They looked atrocious. They were down 5 goals. They fought their way back into it, especially late, but it was too little too late. They almost got over the line, but couldn't quite get there. They lost by a point. They then went over to Optus Stadium to play West Coast Eagles, who, granted, have been better, especially since about the round 3 or 4 mark, round 4. Gather round was where West Coast kind of turned their season around. But this is still a game that Melbourne should be winning if they want to be actually competitive in the later part of September. You can't be losing this game. And they got beaten quite comfortably by 35 points. So really not a good spot for them at this point. 2 losses in a row. They then had St Kilda at the MCG and did what they needed to. They won this one comfortably. Won the first quarter by 5 goals and then just kind of cruised their way home from there to end up winning by 38 points. Did what they needed to that day. Then they had what is, in my opinion, the worst performance of any team this season. To almost lose by 100 points. They did trail by 100 points to Fremantle at one point. This was at Alice Springs. And it was just a bad showing. They kicked the first 2 goals of the game, and then from then on it was all one-way traffic. And a game where Fremantle looked really good and Melbourne looked so horrible. So I don't know what to make of that one. Round 13, back in Melbourne, they played Collingwood, and to be honest, they kicked horribly again. So this has kind of been a little bit of a story in their season. They've quite a few weeks kicked very, very poorly. This was the worst of the lot. They kicked 6 goals 15, which just isn't going to win you games of football. They were never really in the game. They trailed the whole way. They never led at any point. And poor kicking did cost them. They probably were in the game if they kicked straight, but overall they just weren't in it. They lost every quarter of the match. They didn't really feel like they were in the match at any point. So that's where they're at, sitting middle table, outside the 8 at the bye, after they were 6-2 at one point. It's not a great sign for them. 7-6, sorry, they are after 13 rounds. It's not the end of the world. They're still currently over 50% win record. If they come out in the second half of the year, they can still fight their way back. But the last 5 weeks, but especially the last 2 weeks, has not been a great sign for them. Especially now, Petrarca's potentially out for quite a while. I don't know exactly how long. I haven't heard yet, but he, I would imagine, will probably miss some football at least. It's not a good sign for where they're at the moment and what they can hope to achieve for the second half of the season, I guess. So we'll have a look at some of the stats from the year so far. First quarters, they're not great at. They've only won 5 out of 13, so that's not a great record. To be honest, they're not really great at any quarter, but they kind of just make it work. Second quarters as well, they're only won 6 out of 13, so they're negative in those as well. On average, they're 6.7 points down at half time, which is not ideal. Third quarters, they're slightly better. They've won 7 out of 13, so 7 and 6, and plus 2 points. Their last quarters are where they're best at. Once again, only 7 and 6 in last quarters, but they are plus 4.5 points per quarter. So certainly their finishing is better than their starting, but it's still not great reading in any quarter, to be honest. Certainly an area that it's just a full game that they need to improve, but probably most specifically their first halves. Their first quarters over the last 5 weeks have been really quite bad. Outside of the St Kilda game, they've been 30 points down against Carlton, 14 points down against West Coast, 17 points down against Fremantle, and 15 points against Collingwood, all in the last 5-week period. They did have the one game where they were 25 points up at quarter time against St Kilda, but outside of that, they've been quite poor in that first quarter. But they've been poor throughout most of those games as well. So, yeah, it's where they're sitting at the moment. They're kind of struggling in a lot of facets. Looking at their some of their other stats, disposals, typically, especially early season, they got quite smacked in disposal count, which doesn't really affect the result, but it's just an indicator of how they play their football. Especially the 4-week period going into their first bye, they were minus 23 Hawthorn, minus 36 Port Adelaide, minus 56 Adelaide, minus 63 Brisbane. Outside of that, it's probably fairly even, but still slightly down. But yeah, they just don't just over dispose the ball, I guess. They do have quite a high handball to kick ratio compared to a lot of teams, especially the last month. Like their game against Fremantle was way too many handballs. It was almost a 50-50 ratio, and again against Collingwood it was a lot lower than the previous week, but it was still too high in my opinion. And it's kind of been, I guess, kind of their last month. Although the St Kilda game was the opposite, and that's the one they won. So maybe it's a sign that when they do over handball it a bit too much, it might be the pressure they're under, it might be a game plan, I don't know, but they do tend to not do quite so good in those games. Inside 50 count, overall for the season, it's not too bad, but there's just been a few blowout games where they've been smacked in inside 50s. So that was the Port Adelaide game, they were minus 21, they still won that game, so no harm done there. West Coast, they were minus 21, they did lose that game, and Fremantle, they were minus 31, which they obviously got absolutely pumped in. Comparatively, I guess, they were plus 26 when they beat St Kilda, they were plus 20 when they lost to Carlton, so read into that what you will. I see that as kind of consistent with a lot of teams this year, that a lot of teams are either winning the inside 50 count massively or losing it massively. There's not many games really where it's even-ish in the inside 50 count. There seems to be a lot of games, and not necessarily towards the winner. A lot of teams are losing matches of football even though they dominate the inside 50 count. This year more than ever, I feel that could be completely wrong. That's just a vibe I get. Disposal efficiency, it's pretty even. They're slightly down on their opposition like overall. What are they? 6 and 7 in terms of match head to head, but overall minus 1.19% per game. Forward efficiency compared to defensive efficiency is probably their best facet of the game. They have a fairly high forward efficiency, even over the last 5-week period where they haven't been playing great football. They tend to win their forward efficiency is a lot better than their opponent's forward efficiency pretty much every week. 10-3 is their head-to-head record, and some of their massive wins, like their win against Richmond was plus 20%. They had a really good period there where, outside of the Brisbane one, they had a very good high forward efficiency. So they were 58.3 against Adelaide. Then they lost to Richmond, which their forward efficiency was down at 38%. Then they jumped back up to 52% for Richmond, 52% again for Geelong. Dropped down to 37% for Carlton, which again they lost, before bouncing back up to 58% against West Coast, but lost that game. But the fact that it was so high kind of made amends for the fact that they were minus 21 inside 50s. Still lost the game, but that kind of counteracted that fact that they got smacked in inside 50 count by so much. Clearance game overall, they get beaten in it most weeks, pretty evenly across centre clearances and stoppage clearances, to be honest. Fremantle obviously was the biggest discrepancy of that for the season. They were minus 25, but they got smacked again by Collingwood on the weekend, minus 10. They also lost it against Sydney and Port Adelaide quite comfortably, and even Brisbane beat them quite comfortably, whereas they haven't really dominated anyone in clearance game outside of Hawthorn in round 2. So they're not great in clearance game, to be honest. It's not the be-all and end-all of a game of football. Like, there's a lot more facets to a game, but they do kind of struggle in the clearance game, and which is surprising with the amount of good players they have in the middle. Maybe they're lacking one or two extra midfielders, but Clayton Oliver, Petrarca, they've got plenty of talent in there. Just Max Gawn, who everybody says is the best ruckman in the league, which I agree with. For that amount of talent, they probably should be doing better in the midfield, in my opinion. But that's how I see it. Contested footy, they're pretty even overall. You take out their minus 42 against Fremantle 2 weeks ago, and that's slightly up. That's the only massive discrepancy in contested footy. They actually smacked Collingwood in contested footy the other day, but yeah, contested footy doesn't mean much if it's the wrong type of contested footy. For example, I feel like their contested footy wins against Collingwood was a lot to do with the fact that Collingwood had them under the pumps so much of the game. The Collingwood heat certainly contributed to that. Uncontested footy, they typically lose this quite comfortably, which isn't a surprise when they don't win the disposal count. Turnover game, they're really good at. This is their best facet of the game for sure. Up until the bye, they hadn't lost the turnover game once. So after the bye, they have lost it twice. One of them was against Richmond, which they did win the game, and the other one was against West Coast, which they lost the match. So I think this is probably their best part of their game is causing turnovers. They won it comfortably against Collingwood, who probably are almost the second best team in terms of turnovers, causing turnovers and not turning it over themselves. And they smacked Collingwood quite comfortably in that facet. Even when they lost by 90 points to Fremantle, they ended up even on the turnover count. So it is clearly a thing that they do really well. It's led probably by Stephen May and Jake Lever. Obviously, Lever's out at the moment, but those two are very good at intercepting. But they do use the ball pretty well, even though there's a few commentators out there saying that they don't use the ball well. I see it differently. They kind of do kick quite well, I think. I don't think they turned it over very often, especially compared to some other teams. So that's my opinion. What else do we have? Interestingly, they've 3 out of their last 5 games, they have not led at any point. So that's the Carlton game, West Coast game, and now the Collingwood game. And then the Fremantle game, they led for the first 14 minutes and then obviously trailed the rest. Whereas for the first, 8 rounds, they were leading by for 90 minutes, pretty much all of those games outside of the Brisbane and Sydney games. Tackles, they're still slightly up, even though they lost the tackle count by 20 to Collingwood on the weekend. I think this is an area of their game that they should probably focus a little bit more on. When they get pumped in the tackle count, they kind of lose the game. So their Brisbane one was their second worst loss of the year, I think, and that was their worst tackling game. Their worst game of the year, obviously, was Fremantle. They were kind of even, but Fremantle didn't need to tackle. They were 90 points up. Collingwood, they lost by 20 that day on the weekend. They lost the tackle count by 20. So those ones were their really bad games, whereas when they win the tackle count, they typically do play better. So they won it against Hawthorn. They were plus 23 that day in tackles. Their other big win was in the tackle count was against Carlton. They were plus 18. They did lose that game, but it was only a point in it against another very good Melbourne team. So not a bad loss in that regard there. Have a look at some of the players this year. So obviously, without a doubt, their most consistent and best player, in my opinion, is Max Gawn. He's the best ruckman in the league for the last 6 or so years, consistently across those years, pretty much every year. He's really good. Petrarca is outstanding as a midfielder. He played a really, really good game round 9 against Carlton. When they lost, he almost got him over the line. He played some really big games between rounds 1, 2, 3 and 4. So against the Bulldogs, Hawthorn, Port Adelaide, Adelaide, in that period where they were winning. He was really good. Even these weeks after when they lose, he's still usually pretty good. When he goes forward, he kicks goals. He gets plenty of it in the middle. He's a very good player. Their backline of Steve May and Lever, when they're playing, they're really good. Obviously, May's battling an injury at the moment. Lever's out. It's leaving them very vulnerable in the backline. Clayton Oliver's season, he's had some really good games. He was great against Geelong. Really good against Geelong. He was pretty solid against the Bulldogs. The rest of the season, he's kind of been okay. Particularly when they lose, I think he tends to not play as well. Like his game against Brisbane wasn't very good. He wasn't great against Collingwood. So I think he's probably a little bit of a barometer. Outside of them, I don't think anyone's really playing great. Fritsch is up and down. He's not getting enough of it, in my opinion. Not getting enough opportunities, which comes with being that deepest forward. I don't know what else to say about many other players on their team because they certainly don't have the depth that maybe they've had over the previous few years. And at the moment, with no Lever and May struggling, it's kind of hurting them a fair bit. So that's everything for the season so far. Let's have a look at what they have to come for the rest of 2024. So they have the bye in round 14. Round 15, they have North Melbourne at the MCG against the bottom of the ladder team. This is where they really need to get their season up and going again. This is a great opportunity for them to play that one. Then round 16, they have Brisbane at the Gabba. Potentially a tough game. Should be a cracker. Obviously, Brisbane beat them in Melbourne this year, so it's a chance for them to fight back and get revenge on them a little bit, I guess. Round 17, they have West Coast at the MCG. Round 18, they have Essendon at the MCG. Then they have a away trip over to Optus Stadium for Fremantle. That will be their second game over at Optus this year. Round 20, they play GWS at the MCG. 21, they play Bulldogs at Marvel Stadium. 22, they play Port Adelaide at the MCG. Then they head up to the Gold Coast for round 23. And then they finish the season with a second match against Collingwood at the MCG. Obviously, they don't play Sydney again this year, so that's a positive. They obviously played them in opening round and then don't see them again. They don't play Carlton again. They do have to play, though, 3rd, 4th and 5th on the current ladder, 7th and 8th as well, and 9th. So, while they don't play the top couple, they certainly play the next few. So, Essendon will be really tough at the MCG and probably one of the more important games of the season for both teams. Fremantle away at Optus is going to be really tough after they got smacked by 92 points in Alice Springs against them 2 weeks ago. Giants at the MCG is a really good chance for them to get a win. Bulldogs at Marvel will be tough. Bulldogs at Marvel is always a tough match. Port Adelaide at the G, they'll be needing to win that one, I reckon. Gold Coast on the Gold Coast will be tough, and finishing with Collingwood at the MCG will also be tough. They certainly, in my opinion, probably need to make use of the next 3 weeks. Obviously, North Melbourne should be a win. West Coast in Melbourne should also be a win. So you'd think they win too. Brisbane in the Gabba will be tough, but if they can win that, win the next 3 games, all of a sudden they have a little bit of confidence, and maybe they're a chance to turn their season back around. Because at the moment, 8 and 7, well, not 8 and 7, 7 and 6. I've skipped a couple of weeks ahead here, but they're 7 and 6. If they win those 3 games, they're 10 and 6 with like however many games that is to go, 7 games to go. 13 probably makes you finals. Maybe need 14, depending on percentage and whatnot. So if they have 10 wins with 7 games to go, they probably only need 4 of the rest, which won't be easy, but it's possible. Where I see them at the moment, I don't see them making finals based on the last 5 weeks. They've been quite poor. They're not the only team that's kind of struggled. Like, you look at it, they're struggling. Geelong have struggled. GWS are struggling. So 3 teams that looked like they were pretty much shoo-ins for finals at about the 6-week mark, 7-week mark, are all kind of in the same sort of scenario at the moment where the season's dropping away a bit. Melbourne's probably the worst of them, though. Their game against Fremantle was horrible. They haven't shown much life over the last 5 weeks, and it's hard to suggest that will turn around. Yes, they've got a couple easier games coming up, North Melbourne and West Coast. Is that enough for them to turn their season around? I don't know. They might really be going into those final 3 games against Port Adelaide, Gold Coast and Collingwood, needing to win all 3 to make finals. I have them probably finishing 10 or 11 at the moment, and that's best case scenario based on what we've seen. But they are capable of still making the 8. I can't see them making top 4 from here, but top 8 is a possibility if they win their next 3 and then get some confidence in them, and maybe get a couple other upset wins, maybe against Essendon, maybe against GWS, and GWS probably they'd be favourites, maybe. But yeah, it's going to be a tough run home for them, but they're capable. It's not impossible. So that's everything I have to say about the Melbourne Demons. Obviously, their last 5 weeks has been tough for them. This bye is probably coming at the perfect time for them, just to reassess how they see themselves and whether they can rebuild for the second half of the year. It'll be interesting to see how long Petrarca's out for. Hopefully not too long, for his sake and for Melbourne's sake, because he's a very good player. But that's everything for Melbourne Demons. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know where you think Melbourne will finish in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning in. Check out all the rest of my content, as I mentioned at the start of the video. We got YouTube, where you're at the moment. Spotify is where the podcast also goes live. And then we've got some socials in Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. So check them all out at All Aussie Rules. Thanks for tuning in. Catch us on the next one.